lead and we cannot support him in leading with this approach. The team captain cannot change the call on the big plays every day. The team can't deliver anything under these circumstances. A weak team definitely cannot succeed in these circumstances. It has to stop. Decide and set direction, deliver, explain. Government isn't actually that hard, but this guy is really making it impossible. And then the response from Mr. Cummings, I'm getting despairing messages from people in meetings. He's carrying around on WhatsApp as usual, creating chaos and undermining everybody. These are WhatsApps, of course, between two of his most senior advisors, well, his cabinet secretary and his chief advisor. Do you agree with those sentiments? Was that what was happening at this time?
I think it's, thank you, I think it's, as I said before lunch, that he did in this period face difficult decisions and blew, as it were, hot and cold on some of them, and that did make it difficult at times for the machine to know which direction it should be moving in.
54. This is embarrassing. That's Lee Kane. And this is a WhatsApp group between Simon Case, Lee Kane and Dominic Cummings. By the weekend, says Dominic Cummings, he'll be saying 6 is untenable, a total disaster. We've got to get everybody back to work. Yes, full trolley mode. And then it didn't take till the weekend. Simon Case, spectacular today, and he's obviously mimicking Mr. Johnson. We want to open up the economy ASAP, forget the bloody virus. Page 56. At the bottom of the page, at the bottom of the text, the WhatsApp screenshot, we look like a terrible, tragic joke. That decision was needed weeks ago. I cannot cope with this. And then a trolley emoji. And Sir Patrick Vallance, document 273901, page 584. PM, Simon Case taking one day at a time. PM is simply not consistent as he wasn't at the beginning. 121. The ridiculous flip-flopping is getting worse, maybe as he recovers, 13th of July. 28th of July, page 101. I'm not sure that's the right reference. In any event, 178, 14th September, Simon Case from a couple of days ago. The Prime Minister is not exactly a consistent interlocutor. 19th of September, page 188, he's all over the place and completely inconsistent. You can see why it was so difficult to get agreement to lockdown first time. Page 252. We have a weak and indecisive Prime Minister. In the face of a viral pandemic, if those views are right, that was a deeply unfortunate position to be in, was it not?
Yes.
You took steps in May of 2020 to recommend significant changes to the operation at the heart of government.
Mm-hmm.
Lord Sedwell, Mark Sedwell, the Cabinet Secretary, had sent a note to the Prime Minister dated the 10th of May called COVID-19 Campaign Next Phase 1367756, in which he points out there in paragraph 1, we should reflect now on how well the state coped with the initial phases as we prepare for the next. Page 2, paragraphs 3 to 6, he sets out the problems with the government in relation to health and care. Essentially, Public Health England, the DHSE, the fragmented social care system not being able to bear the weight. Page 4, paragraphs 12 to 14. He makes suggestions about how meetings should be held. He suggests something called the ministerial implementation groups, and essentially trying to set clearer lines of ministerial and official accountability. Was that report sent because there was a general understanding that the system was not working fundamentally and required significant reform?
Yes, I think by that stage in the pandemic, we all recognised that the way we had gone into it and the way we had managed the challenges had been suboptimal. And this is an opportunity at this stage to as it were, try and reconfigure.
You co-signed a report about 2 weeks later, together with Helen McNamara, did you not?
Yes.
136755. This report has already been seen in evidence, but your signature or your name appears at the end of it, together with Helen McNamara. And it addresses in very trenchant terms, does it not, how meetings aren't working, how people aren't disciplined, there's a bad culture, a culture of chaos, people are exhausted and stressed, people are at war with themselves, number 10's at war with someone. And if we could go over the page.
Could you remind me of the date of this?
Yes. We think, milady, that this first draft was before the 17th of May, because that's when the final draft was prepared. We don't have a date for this particular document. Does that chronology sound right to you?
That sounds right, yes.
And the report showed, did it not, dysfunctionality, lack of discipline, chaos, and a significant degree of misogyny.
I agree.
Women were talked over. People shouted at each other. There were too many people in meetings. Did you talk the Prime Minister through this report?
Yes, I believe I did. If I may
Please.
give a little bit more background in terms of the report. I mean, as I think I said earlier in terms of the crisis response, we weren't ready for the crisis, and so we ended up having to respond in a way which was very ad hoc at every single level. And what we did as part of that process is, I suppose, we created structures which were extremely complicated and brought in people at every level to deal with immediate problems. So if you look at the Cabinet Office, Mark Sedwill brought in a very large number of Directors General, the most senior people, to deal with problems, and in a sense entirely logically. If you have so many problems and you're trying to work out how to deal with them, you bring in people and you appoint them to take them on. In Downing Street, Dominic Cummings did pretty much the same thing. And so he brought in Tom Shinner, he brought in a lot of data people dealing with some of the problems we were identifying then, but creating a very high level of complexity. And the Prime Minister himself had a very similar sort of reaction, which he started when he lost confidence in the government system. He reached for different people, Lord Dighton or Kate Bingham or whoever it might, Lady Bingham, whoever it might be. And so you have a situation during the crisis, because everything was so pressured, we've created a complexity and a series of competing structures, which means that actually by this stage the government machine is facing serious problems. And this piece of work by Helen McNamara and I was designed to shine a light on that and to try and enable us to press reset and get ourselves better placed for the next phase of COVID. And I suppose what it's doing is looking at working practices, shifting the committee structure away from MIGS to a COVID-O, COVID-S, creating a new COVID unit rather than a whole group of separate different entities, as it were, headed by DGs, underpinning the COVID unit with a proper analytical unit and delivery unit, and then trying to get people out of number 10. One of the challenges we faced in number 10 at this phase of the crisis was everybody, because in a sense the crisis structures hadn't worked in the Cabinet Office, everything had gravitated to number 10. And so by this stage in the crisis, you had far too much activity in number 10, far too many people, and far too little clarity as to who exactly is responsible for what. And so this report is really designed to try and press a reset, and is very, very stark in the challenges we're facing, because that's the best way, Helen and I thought, to get people to really acknowledge that we needed a different approach.
The outcome of this review, Mr. Reynolds, was, as you say, that there was a difference in a change in the methodology. So COVID-S and COVID-O were instituted. There was a COVID task force. But much of your report, and Helen McNamara's report, was about discipline, wasn't it? It was about people talking over each other, macho behaviour, misogyny, rudeness, people taking charge in meetings, not listening to others. Mm-hmm. None of that was going to be changed by a change in the committee structure. What was done in terms of the personnel and the disciplinary problem that was apparent?
Well, I think some of the changes in structure were going to help with that, with respect, because what it's about is getting people out of Downing Street. I mean, part of the challenge in the COVID crisis is normally, in a normal crisis situation, you have, as it were, decision-making structures outside number 10, and you have a limited number of people moving back and forth into number 10 to talk through the Prime Minister. What was happening in...
Slow down.
Oh, sorry.
I should have asked you too many hours ago.
Sorry.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
Sorry.
You have a limited number of people moving back and forth into number 10 to talk through the Prime Minister what was happening.
So what happens in COVID is a lot of the activity actually moves into number 10, and that injects tremendous stress into the organisation, and the number of people there are much greater. So part of the solution to this is to actually go back to rather, as it were, more traditional, more normal ways of working. The other thing, and the reason why I wanted to discuss it with Prime Minister Dominic Cummings, Cabinet Secretary, and Helen McNamara, is you needed the top team of senior figures to agree this is a genuine problem and to drive that change. That's not something I as PPS can drive. You need to get collective buy-in. And the challenge we face then is, in a sense, because there were interpersonal issues which emerged at that stage, it became very difficult to have that conversation.
Was there a notable reduction in the misogyny, the superhero culture, the interpersonal problems thereafter?
I think there was a significant change in the reduction of directors general in the building, and that reduced the superhero culture to an extent we're talking about. Yes, I think in terms of the diversity of decision making, in terms of the treatment of women, I agree. I think that remained an ongoing cultural issue, which I think we could have done more to address.
Because the personnel did not fundamentally change, other than Mr. Case came on board, became, I think, a Director General or a Permanent Secretary in number 10 or the Cabinet Office. Lord Sedwell left his post. Mark Sedwell left his post around about the 15th of May, but stayed on till the autumn. But the rest of the personnel remained the same, did they not?
Yes, and I think also, as I say, I mean, if we wanted to drive that change, all the senior leaders needed to sit down together and actually talk it through. I think in terms of the diversity, and this is not the primary driver of this, but had someone like Helen McNamara been appointed into the role as Perm-Sec COVID, I think that would have both sent a very powerful signal, but I think it would have helped change some of that dimension, although I recognise that to drive fundamental change, you need everybody to come in behind it.
But there wasn't a meeting, was there, which everybody sat down and thrashed out the problems that were there in terms of personnel? You had recommended Helen McNamara as a candidate for permanent secretary, but that didn't happen.
Yeah.
And Lord Sedwell, Mark Sedwell, had a meeting with the Prime Minister, as a result of which you became aware from a subsequent debriefing that essentially the Prime Minister had lost confidence in him. Is that correct?
Correct.
Could we have 265620, page 2? These are WhatsApp messages between you and Mark Sedwell, dated the 15th of May. In the middle of the page, I'm sorry, I've lost my bearings. If you could scroll back out, about a third of the way down the page. Mark said, well, working from home, I'll be in a train. I don't want another conversation about myself before the weekend. Any news on that? You. This is what I suspect he wants to discuss. So shall I say you're willing to discuss on Monday? Him. I presume from this that sense is not prevailing. Mark said, well, if he's going to try to scapegoat me, he can do so face to face. What was the sense that Mark Sedwell said was not prevailing?
I assume that was about going back on the suggestion that he might move on from his role.
What happened was that that meeting, essentially, he was sacked. He was told that the Prime Minister had no confidence in him and he would leave in the autumn.
I don't think it was that clear. I think I think you'd have to speak to the Prime Minister and Mark Sedwell as to exactly what was discussed in that meeting, and that's why in my witness statement I talk about losing confidence. But I think the detail and the precise meanings were unclear, and that's why I had a meeting with the Prime Minister to try and dissuade him of this course, but also to try and understand exactly what the plan was.
Were you able to understand what the plan was meant to be and what it was the Prime Minister had meant to have in his mind?
Well, I think the outcome, at least, again, of my meeting with the Prime Minister on, I think it was the Thursday or the Friday of that week, was that Simon Case was to come in as the permanent secretary for COVID, that Mark Sedwell would move on at some point in the autumn, and that there would also be a new NSA appointed, so you would there's a double-hatted role under Mark Sedwell, so you would create a new NSA role over that period too.
Just pause there. NSA, do you mean National Security?
National Security Advisor,
Right.
Sorry.
And why does Mark Sedwell say in the WhatsApp to you, if he's going to try to scapegoat me, he can do so face to face? What do you understand that reference to scapegoat to mean?
Well, I believe that he was concerned that he was being blamed for the shortcomings of the first phase of COVID, and felt as a result that would be, as it were, scapegoating.
All right. Now, Barnard Castle, please, and events in Downing Street. Could we have, please, 265620 on the screen, page 4? These are WhatsApps between you and Mark Sedwell on the 24th of May, 2020. If I can find the right passage. In the middle of the page, at 1650, Mark Sedwell says, difficult for them if they're asked if he breached the guidance. You, about an hour later, seem to go okay. Mark Sedwell, not sure how well outside the bubble. Let's see if it's still on the front pages tomorrow. Martin Reynolds, it's bound to be. Mark Sedwell, yes, but how? PM has put his own and the government credibility on the line. people are genuinely angry. This isn't just a bubble story. Were you discussing the Barnard Castle affair and Mr. Cummings and the press conference which he held in the event on the 25th of May in the Rose Garden in Downing Street?
On the was it 25th or 24th? Sorry, I'm confused.
I think the press conference is on the 25th, but you and Mark Sedwell are talking about a conversation somebody has had with Cummings about whether or not he breached the guidance. But it is all to do, is it not, with Mr. Cummings's drive to Barnard Castle on Easter Sunday, the 12th of April, 2020.
I agree. I wonder whether on the 24th there was actually a press conference for the Prime Minister. So, in a sense, on the 24th we're talking about the Prime Minister's press conference.
I might already have emerged at that press conference the day before.
Yeah, I think that's what I think. Sorry, that's why I'm slightly confused. I think there are two events. One is the press conference, and then there is Dominic Cummings' statement in the Rose Garden.
Right. Now, in Sir Patrick Valance's diaries for the 25th of May, 273901, page 67, he says that he and Professor Sir Chris Whitty were asked to do the press conference. So that may be a reference to the Prime Ministerial press conference. And he says, 273901, page 67. CW, Chris Whitty and I, very reluctant to do the press conference. It's highly political and will be focused on Dominic Cummings. PM seems very bullish and wants to have everything released sooner and more extremely than we would. Wants to divert from the Dominic Cummings fiasco. Court have gone to Durham, clearly against the rules. All very worrying. Cabinet all upbeat and breezy confidence incredibly alarming. In his diaries, Sir Patrick suggests that you, along with others, to use his word, strong-armed him and Sir Chris Whitty to attend the press conference. Did you?
I think the first thing I should say on this is I spoke to the Prime Minister at the time and questioned whether it was sensible for him to support Dominic Cummings in the way he was doing. So I had a private conversation with him, I believe. And then I did speak to, I think, Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty and suggest that they might, that it was important for public confidence for them to appear alongside the Prime Minister at this press conference. I don't view that as strong-arming. I think it was actually Chris Whitty said to me and explained why it was inappropriate for him to stand alongside the Prime Minister while he was justifying his behaviour. And since I agreed with his analysis and obviously deferred to his analysis, I then backed off. But I don't believe I was strong-arming him in that sense.
Could we have page 583? The apparatchiks tried to strong-arm us. Lee Kane, James Bowler, perhaps.
James Slack, I would guess.
James Slack,
I would guess.
James Slack, and even Martin, his PPS.
Fine, but I mean, I think that's still in terms of my perception of what I was doing, is I was suggesting to him, I'm not sure I would describe that as strong-arming, and certainly my impression, I have to say, is that both Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty are more than capable of telling me when they disagree with what I'm suggesting.
The apparent, I say apparent because the police have not at any time spoken formally to Mr. Cummings about it, and no steps have been taken in relation to the allegation. But the apparent breach of the rules by him was extremely damaging, was it not?
Yes.
It was obvious to you and everybody else in Downing Street how important observance of the rules was. Setting an example was of prime importance.
Yes.
On the 20th of May, so around this time, you sent an email about how nice it would be to make the most of this lovely weather and have some socially distanced drinks in the garden this evening. Bring your own booze. I don't intend to ask you whether you received a fixed penalty notice. You may or may not have done, and it's not fair to invite you to say whether you did. And it forms no part of this inquiry to rule on or determine liability, civilly or criminally. But do you accept that the sending of that email and the events which ensued were again deeply damaging to trust in the government and damaging to public compliance?
Well, I think I would first like to say how deeply sorry I am for my part in those events and for the email message which went out that day. And I'd like to apologise unreservedly to the families of all those who suffered during COVID for all the distress caused. In terms of the coverage of this event in the garden, it actually broke into the news about 15 months later. So while I totally accept I was totally wrong in the way I sent the email around and for the event, I think the impact on public confidence, although obviously now in terms of public confidence more generally it has a serious impact, in terms of the pandemic at that time it had less impact.
Mr. Reynolds, the news broke of these goings-on in Downing Street in December 2021, whilst we were still in the middle of the pandemic, were we not?
Yes.
Right. And then on the 12th of June, you sent messages by WhatsApp to Lee Kane. Could we have 265621? In the middle of the page, Lee Kane, I'm not sure it works at all, to be honest, which would be a shame. I don't see how we can have some kind of party, though. Martin Reynolds, so you're saying nothing for her. I think it's your decision, my friend, not mine. But it obviously comes with rather substantial comms risks. And then later, at the end of June, there are further WhatsApps in relation to another event in the garden. So the first matter, the first issue, which I've put to you, which is the bring your own booze event in the garden, was not a solitary event, was it?
No.
No.
And I apologise unreservedly again for these events.
And you realise, of course, that for the public whose loved ones were dying in their droves, this caused incredible offence and added to their immeasurable pain.
Yes. And as I say, I'm deeply sorry for that.
I have no further questions.
I don't think there are any Rule 10 questions.
My lady, maybe there is one area that I have failed to explore in relation to which we've indicated that CTI would ask a question. Did Mr. Reynolds, the Prime Minister, make disparaging remarks about the existence or severity of long COVID, to your understanding, to your knowledge?
I'm afraid I can't remember or recall.
Those are all the questions then.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reynolds. Sorry, forgive me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My lady, the next witness is Imran Shafi. Yes, please.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Could you give the inquiry, please, your full name?
Imran Faisal Shafi.
Mr. Shafi, you've been good enough to provide a statement at 215035. which you signed as being true on the 13th of June 2023. I hesitate because I can't see page 38, but I think we can see the date on the top right-hand corner. There we are, 19th of June 2023. So thank you for your assistance in providing that statement. You were the private secretary to the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, for public services. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you were so from March 2018, from which we deduce that you must have been a private secretary before Mr. Johnson became Prime Minister, to March of 2021, so approximately a year after the pandemic started.
That's correct.
I think before that you'd been a management consultant at McKinsey, and you'd also worked for some time in the Treasury as a policy advisor.
Yes.
We've just been hearing evidence about the role of private secretaries, and it may be that you've seen the evidence from Martin Reynolds, Mr. Sheffy, whilst you were waiting. You were responsible as a private secretary for a particular portfolio. What portfolio was that?
It changed during my time at Number 10. When the pandemic started, my portfolio was everything to do with the Department of Health, everything to do with the Department for Education. Everything.
I'm going to ask you just to go a bit slower, please.
Sorry. Everything to do with the Department of Health,
Yes.
the Department for Education, the Department for Work and Pensions, and the Department for Culture, Media and Sport.
In that role, was it part of your functions to deal with the Prime Minister,
Yes.
submit written advice,
On behalf of others, yes.
relay his comments or decisions to others for action,
Yes.
arrange and attend meetings with
Yes.
him? It's apparent from the material that much of the heavy lifting is done in advance of meetings with the Prime Minister.
Yes.
Conclusions are drafted, information is conveyed, the general steer or course of what is to be decided is laid out for him or her to decide what needs to be done.
That's often the case, yes.
That's not
That's often the case.
often the
Yeah,
case.
often the case.
How well did the system of private secretaries work, in your opinion, in terms of putting the right information in front of the Prime Minister, providing for clear lines of accountability, and for providing that the best decisions were reached on the information available?
I think overall, broadly, well, there are obviously through the pandemic many times where the whole system was under huge stress, but in general, I think the system works.
To what extent was Mr. Reynolds concerned in the substantive issues in relation to your portfolio area, so public services, health, education, and so on?
In normal times, very little, because a lot of the areas that I worked on had quite a strong public spending angle, and so it was, rather than Martin Reynolds being the sort of my supervisor on that, Stuart Glassborough, who was the deputy principal private secretary, who was more connected to the Treasury, was closer to the work that I was doing.
And in abnormal times?
In the early periods of COVID, you've heard from Martin about the role that he played in the early days.
Was he engaged, perhaps to a lesser extent, but engaged nevertheless, in the substantive debate that was going on about COVID and commenced, as far as the private secretaries appear to be concerned, late January onwards?
I think so.
But you must recall so.
Yes, but substantively sort of stretches in terms of how far that goes.
My lady, the Cabinet Office disclosed to us very late on Friday or at the end of last week WhatsApp group thread between Mr. Case, Simon Case, and Mr. Shafi. And because of the shortness of time, we've not been able to disclose that document to the core participants, or indeed, I think, the witness. But I'm therefore going to just read out the relevant part. On the 13th of September 2000, so the same year at 12:30, Simon Case WhatsApped you to say, "This is all a bit of a farce, to be honest. I'm not sure why we don't just operate a normal private office system, which involved the lead private secretary engaging the boss on an issue on behalf of everyone." So in light of that WhatsApp, were there times in the course of the first year of the pandemic where the system of information coming up to the boss, the Prime Minister, from the private secretary did not work terribly well?
So I've just had a chance to look at that exchange this morning. I think that is a reference to some questions that the Prime Minister was asking, and the Prime Minister put those questions on a WhatsApp group with a certain number of individuals. I wasn't on that group with individuals. I think, although you'd need to check with the Cabinet Secretary what his meaning was, but I think his meaning is, I wish that the Prime Minister was asking the lead person the question rather than this other group.
But it's the Cabinet Secretary who describes the private secretary system as all a bit of a farce. Why don't we have a normal private office system? So,
again, I don't have the exchange in front of me, but I think what he's describing as a farce is the way questions are being asked.
in the same WhatsApp group in July, so 2 months before, at 11:03 on the 31st of July, on a related issue, Simon Case says, "These number 10 WhatsApp groups make everyone get more wound up, not less." And you reply, yes. I want to ask you, therefore, what did you make of the fact that there were so many communications being made by WhatsApp?
I think, given the need to move at speed with a lot of people working from home, it played an important role in having quick communication. Again, I've only just had the chance to review that thread. I think, again, the point there is there were lots and lots of people making comments about policy who might not necessarily have been that close to the policy making, but were part of the wider number 10 machine, and who were raising questions about the approach. And I think, again, you need to check with the Cabinet Secretary what his meaning was, but if I was going to guess, it would be we don't want to keep on opening up debates once we close them down.
Would you agree that there are very real problems with any kind of use of WhatsApp for the purposes of governance?
I think there are long-term lessons to be learned about how we use electronic messaging, yes.
There are issues concerning transparency, of course.
Yes.
Things are said in the heat of the moment which may simply not be true or accurate or reflect the course of the debate.
Yes, in the same way that people might have comments in normal times outside of meetings which aren't recorded.
But they're a good indication, are they not, of the state of mind, perhaps, of the interlocutor?
They can be.
Were there quite complicated management lines in number 10? So you've got, obviously, the Cabinet Secretary, you've got the civil service structure, you've got the advisors, you've got private secretaries, the principal private secretary. It seems to have made for quite a complex system of advice giving to the Prime Minister. Would you agree?
It is not a completely hierarchical organisation in the way that other organisations might be. So, for instance, in the army, everybody reports up to
Mr. Shafi,
one person.
you must go slower. Sorry. So in the army, everyone reports up.
So there might be more clear hierarchy in other organisations in number 10 because there is a mix of political staff and civil service staff. The hierarchy isn't always as clear.
Perhaps it's the nature of the field, high politics, high governance. the material may suggest that there were a number of competing power sources in Downing Street, personality clashes, and we can see, and you're aware of it from Helen McNamara and Martin Reynolds' report, a high degree of dysfunctionality in terms of dealing with the Prime Minister. Would you agree?
Yes.
And none of that lent itself well to the best sort of decision-making, did it?
No.
When, in late January and February, Downing Street generally first became aware of the problem of the repatriation of UK nationals from China, the emergence of the virus, what was the general response on the part of the Prime Minister? Was it a big deal? Was it something to be watched out for? Was it to be dismissed like swine flu? What was the position?
I don't think he thought it was a big deal at that time. He had a briefing with the Chief Medical Officer on the 4th of February, I believe, where some of the potential implications were set out. So I would characterise it as something to keep an eye out on, but also he clearly and repeatedly stressed the need to avoid overreaction, which appears through various meetings in that time.
So there was an email string on the 29th of January, 146557, and we'll start with page 1. We can see from the top of the page that Sir Patrick Vallance emails number 10 with minutes of a SAGE meeting which had taken place on the 28th of January, in relation to which Sir Chris Whitty had prepared a summary. Is that correct?
Yes.
And at the bottom of the page, we can see that summary where Sir Chris is addressing a member of Downing Street, William Waugh. Is he a private secretary or?
He was a special advisor.
Dear Will, sorry for the delay. I've been back to back. I'm seeing Patrick Vallance and some of the key people here, so they are aware of what I've sent. This is written informally for you, but can be turned into a more formal note for ministers. So he's telling Downing Street what his take is on the SAGE meeting. We're working on 4 scenarios, but in practice only 2 are probably worth considering for planning at this point. And number 1 is China has a major outbreak but brings it under control. Cases are seeded, that is to say, there are infections in small numbers to other countries, but it doesn't take off. The other, at 2, at the bottom of the page, is the opposite end of the risk scale and is our reasonable worst-case scenario for which plans are being developed. With R, a reproduction rate of 2 to 3, so one person infects 2 to 3 people in an unimmunized population, mortality of maybe 2%. A doubling time of maybe 3 to 5 days and an incubation period of mean 5 days, this could, within the next few weeks, become widespread and turn into a significant pandemic relatively quickly. And then he addresses who would be most affected, older people or those with pre-existing health conditions. And essentially, he says to number 10, there is a, to use his wonderful words, a difficult dichotomous decision in that the economic consequences of overcalling can be substantial, but the mortality and social consequences of undercalling are even more substantial. And I want to ask you, therefore, what did your team, you're responsible for this portfolio area as a private secretary, and the Prime Minister make of this warning? Was it something that caused you to think a great deal more carefully about whether or not the reasonable worst-case scenario might ensue? Or did you take from this that there was a risk in overreaction? Was it something that wasn't going to go away and you absolutely had to be on top of this to make sure that you knew what might happen? What was the response generally in number 10?
I think I read this as a very serious email and something that required due attention. That's part of the reason why we got the Chief Medical Officer to brief the Prime Minister on this issue a few days later.
There was a note put into his prime ministerial box, was there not, on the 30th of January, INQ 136737. Prime Minister, a brief update on coronavirus and evacuations of British nationals and dependents from Hubei. You say it, or rather it is said at the bottom, a COBRA ministerial meeting chaired by Matt Hancock will take place tomorrow. The material around this time, Mr. Shafi, appears to focus on the evacuation, the repatriation of UK nationals, as opposed to addressing in detail the likelihood of the risk that the virus would spread to the United Kingdom in an uncontrolled way. Why was that focus on repatriation?
It's a good question. I think, firstly, I think the meeting with the Prime Minister on the 4th of February does talk about a potential chance of the reasonable worst case scenario. I think it's about 10%, the CMO says.
Yes.
But I think you're right that a lot of the focus at the centre was how do we make sure this doesn't come to the UK or we can contain it, rather than getting into the difficult measures that you might have to take should you fail to contain.
136733 is that update from the Civil Contingency Secretariat on the 3rd of February. Where a situation update is given on the outbreak of novel coronavirus, Wuhan novel coronavirus, how many tests have been concluded, how many have tested positive, and so on and so forth, and then over the page. British nationals in China, communications, and then this, cross-government meetings, clear references to a SAGE meeting, the fact of a CCS cross-government meeting, further ad hoc cross-government officials meetings, CCS chairing a cross-government meeting, and then a COBRA for ministers on the 5th of February. So it looks as if, Mr. Shafi, when the warning was received, a lot was done in terms of setting up the meetings, the structures, the debate. Would you agree?
How do you mean by the debate?
The novel coronavirus. It's apparent that it's in China. It's beginning to leak. There have been cases outside China. And because of the information that's been received in the heart of the UK government, these SAGE meetings, CCS meetings, COBRA meetings are all beginning to be held. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
On the 4th of February, there was a DHSC departmental meeting, 146558. And this letter from Downing Street to, I think, a private secretary in the DHSC said, the Prime Minister met your Secretary of State, colleagues from the Centre for his first DHSC departmental performance meeting. We began with a short update on coronavirus. The Prime Minister stressed the need to continue to explain our stance to maintain public confidence. And then there's a debate about travel restrictions. And then the letter goes on to deal with objectives for the NHS. To what extent had the coronavirus issue made its way to the centre of government concern or government action in the first week in February?
It had, but probably not to the extent that it ought to have had. So,
just pause there. Why not to the extent that it ought to have done?
So I think this meeting is a good example of that. So it was a meeting with the Health Secretary and the Prime Minister. It had reached number 10 because the first part of that meeting was focused on coronavirus. But then the rest of the meeting, the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary wanted to discuss progress on building 40 hospitals or recruiting 50,000 nurses or the other manifesto commitments that were very important to the government.
To what extent should number 10 have stepped in and said to the DHSC, forget the NHS and long-term objectives, we want to know what you're doing about coronavirus, as opposed to the DHSC saying to number 10, forget talking about NHS objectives, we've got a serious problem here relating to coronavirus?
I don't think we're the experts on that, so we need to be guided by the department to tell us what the important issues are.
It's obvious that coronavirus as an issue was put before the Prime Minister repeatedly in February. We can have perhaps 136739, which is an extract from his diary for, if we can go forward, the 14th of February. No, I think I've got the wrong reference. Friday the 14th of February, there is between 10 o'clock and 10:45, or there should be an entry for a coronavirus meeting. The matter was discussed repeatedly in COBRA meetings, was it not?
Yes.
So there were a series of COBRA meetings chaired by Mr. Hancock MP beginning on the 24th of February, and a further 4 meetings 29th of January, 5th of February, 18th of February and 26th of February. Is that correct?
Yes.
The first one on the 24th of January is at 56214. Page 1 shows us who is present. Page 2 shows us that from number 10 you attended, the bottom right-hand corner. Page 3 at paragraph 2. It'll be over one more page, I think, then. Information is given in paragraph 2 about the number of confirmed cases, confirmed deaths. The true number was likely higher, with modelling indicating between 1,000 and 10,000 cases. There was no clear evidence of sustained transmission outside of Wuhan. What did number 10 make of the fact that the CMO had reported there was no clear evidence of sustained transmission, as opposed to saying there was no sustained transmission?
I don't think we appreciated that nuance at the time. And I think throughout February, there wasn't a clear call on whether there was sustained community transmission in the UK, for instance.
Was number 10 aware of this issue, of course, and the need to ensure that they understood whether there was sustained transmission?
I think, yes, we knew that at the point at which in the UK we could evidence sustained community transmission, it was very likely that contain approaches would fail.
And you began to understand that there was sustained transmission and that control would likely fail during the course of middle to late February?
I think more late than middle.
But well before, of course, the change of strategy on the 13th of March, about which, of course, to which we'll come.
Yes.
It was understood, wasn't it, that there was sustained transmission, and that if the virus got a grip, got a hold in the United Kingdom, there was no effective means of controlling it thereafter.
There were means to mitigate, and the plan through late February and early March was to mitigate the epidemic rather than suppress.
But that wasn't the question. Was it understood that there was no means of controlling the virus, stopping it from spreading throughout the community?
Yes, I think that's right.
All right. And that was, you say, mid, more late?
I think more late rather than mid.
All right. On the 29th of January, Cobra 56226. You weren't, I think, an attendee at this Cobra. If we go to the second page, and a person whose name has been redacted attended on behalf of number 10. If you go to page 3, we can see a number of chief medical officers dialed in. If we go to page 5, the CMO and the CSA updated the meeting. Paragraph 3, UK planning assumptions based on the reasonable worst case scenario. There were 2 scenarios to be considered. The second one, which was that there would be a pandemic, was plausible, but it may take weeks to months. It obviously didn't take months. When did you begin to realise that it would be sooner than had been foretold at that 29th of January meeting of COBRA?
I think the outbreak in Italy was a big wake-up call to everybody.
So the last week of February?
Yes.
21st of February?
Around then, 21st, 22nd.
On the 5th of February, another COBRA took place, 56215. If we go to page 2, we can see the official attendees. For number 10, you attended along with Sir Ed Lister, as he then was, correct?
Yes.
Page 3, we can see the CMOs attended. Page 5, current situation update. More information about incubation period, latent period, paragraphs 3, the Minister of State at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office gives an update. 4, Secretary, the Permanent Secretary for the Department of Health and Social Care, so Sir Christopher Wormold, talks about arrangements for isolation. If you could scroll back out, please. Thank you. And then at 6, the Chair invites the CMO to summarise the latest scientific advice on limiting the transmission of the novel coronavirus into the United Kingdom. The CMO said that the latest advice from SAGE estimated that if the UK reduced imported infections by 50%, it was expected that the onset of any epidemic in the United Kingdom would be delayed by about 5 days. If this was increased to 75%, it would be delayed by 10 days, to 90%, 15 days, and 95% plus delayed for potentially a month. Number 10 understood, therefore, from the 5th of February, that restrictions on borders would have to be very, very stringent indeed in order to be able to delay the spread of the virus. And even then, it would only buy a limited amount of time. Correct? Number 10 also understood from as early as the 5th of February that once the virus breached our borders and couldn't be controlled by a sophisticated test and trace system, it would then be rampant in the community.
No, I think there's a difference between breaching the borders and sustained community transmission. So you could have people visiting from Wuhan or their families having infections in the UK. I think that's different from sustained person-to-person transmission in the UK.
So what did you find out when you asked, well, how many cases of inbound travellers can we manage and check, trace, contact to make sure that it doesn't get a hold in the community?
I don't recall that specific discussion.
You were told, were you not, in late February that Public Health England could only manage 5 coronavirus cases a week with all the contacts that those 5 cases would give rise to?
Could well have been, yes.
So what was your reaction when you realised that you couldn't stop the virus coming in for any length of time, and there were very, very distinct limits on the amount of index cases that could be tested, traced, contacted, isolated.
I think from late February, increasing concern as to how the UK would manage this pandemic.
What was the solution?
I'm not the expert on the solution, but I sought to press the system to provide updates and proposals to the Prime Minister on what they thought the system, what they saw the solution ought to be.
On the 18th of February, Cobra sat again, 56227. Page 1, we can see the 18th of February and the ministerial attendees. Page 2, from number 10, Ed Lister again, and then over the page, page 3, CMOs. Page 5, paragraph 2, the CMO updated on the global risk. The risk to Japan was primarily from domestic transmission. Both escalation to a global pandemic and the isolation of the majority of cases to China remained realistic possibilities. And then, if you could scroll back out, please. I think over the page, there are references to planning for legislation. The chair said any bill would only be employed in a reasonable worst-case scenario. And then over the page, planning for a reasonable worst-case scenario, next phase, the director of the Civil Contingency Secretariat, Catherine Hammond, said that there was work to be done to create a clear plan of activity across the UK government from the moment of sustained transmission to its estimated peak, which was likely to be a period of 3 months. A detailed agenda of decisions and actions required over a period of 12 weeks was required. Presumably, this Cobra was reported back to you as being the private secretary in charge of this portfolio in Downing Street.
There were two private secretaries working on the issue, so I think the redacted name is the other private secretary. But yes, we probably would have discussed
Tara.
it. Yes.
Right. Did you therefore understand from this minute and the director of the Civil Contingency Secretariat that as at the 18th of February, work had yet to be done to create a clear plan of activity, whatever that means?
It's a fair reading of the minute, I think. Well, I mean, you'd have to ask the person who actually said the comment, but I suspect what they meant was some work had been done and a lot more work was yet to do.
Mr. Cummings, the inquiry is aware, called for plans to be provided to Downing Street.
Yes.
You're aware of that?
Yes.
In fact, he made repeated requests. It became apparent, didn't it, that there was no clear plan setting out how the government might respond to a viral pandemic with this characteristics.
I agree with that. I think there are two parts to it. There's the strategic plan of is this something that we can mitigate whilst protecting the NHS, or do we need to suppress? And then there's the question of operational plans of do we have enough PPE? Do we have enough ventilators? How are we doing hospital discharge? So I think on both of those areas, the plans could have been more detailed, but saying there is a single plan, there are lots of facets to that, I think.
All right, well, let's have a look at the strategy first. So in your statement, you say that the initial approach, the broad approach, envisaged what is called, or what was called, a one-peak strategy.
Yes.
And so that we can understand what was meant by this, is this the position? Viruses go in waves. And the danger of suppressing a first wave, pushing it down so that the reproduction rate is lower than 1, so as to stop exponential growth, is that it recoils back up as soon as the suppression is lifted. Correct?
Correct.
And when it does so, because you've suppressed the first wave, the virus hasn't been allowed to spread widely, so people haven't become infected by and large, and therefore they haven't got immunity.
Correct.
So the thinking was this: if the first wave is just reduced rather than suppressed, so mitigated, then because the overall size of the first wave of the epidemic is reduced, fewer people will become ill or die.
Correct, or at any given point in time.
And a byproduct of that approach, the mitigation approach, is because you're not suppressing the wave completely, large numbers of the population will become infected.
Yes.
Is that what herd immunity was thought to mean?
I would add a final point to that, which yes to all of that, and then a final point, which is at a certain proportion of the population, and I'm not an epidemiologist, so this is just my understanding, at a certain point of the population being infected, there are not enough new people for the virus to infect, and that's the sort of the technical herd immunity.
Yes. Herd immunity can either take place when the population is sufficiently vaccinated, or it's become sufficiently infected that the virus has got nowhere else to go in terms of infecting new people.
Yes.
Correct. So, and obviously there is an issue about herd immunity, because herd immunity denotes that large numbers of people may still become infected and may die. Correct?
Yes, in a one peak threshold, many
Yes.
people will die.
And the healthcare system may still be overrun.
Yes.
And some people may not be immune or get immunity, may be reinfected.
Yes, we didn't know what the longevity of immunity was at that point.
Right. And there are other issues, aren't there, about how effective it is or how possible it is to hermetically seal parts of the population anyway, whilst you allow the virus to continue its approach through the rest.
Yeah.
But why, Mr. Shafi, did the government, so number 10, the Cabinet Office, SAGE, SPI-M, spend so much time worrying about the strategic issue? Shall we suppress and risk a spring back, an uncoiling of the spring, or shall we mitigate? As opposed to asking itself the question, whichever way you cut it, the loss of life and illness is going to be massive, and we must take steps to deal with that.
So I don't think there was a proper discussion in February about suppress or mitigate. I think the system, number 10 included, defaulted into accepting that the pandemic flu pan approach, which is more of a mitigate approach rather than a suppress approach, was the right way forward. In hindsight, there should have been advice with different options presented to ministers on you can go this way and the costs and benefits are as such, and you can go this way, the costs and benefits are as such. And even at a point where lots of things were uncertain, I think, given that some other countries took an alternative approach, I think it's a reasonable question to ask why we didn't frame the choice in that way to ministers.
In essence, give them practical options. This is the problem. We are going to be overrun. What can be done to control it, or to regain control, or to deal with the death and illness, as opposed to this doctrinal or strategic debate?
So I don't think there was a strategic debate. So
There are many, many emails, WhatsApps from the Prime Minister saying, have we won the argument on herd immunity? Is it suppression or mitigation?
But that's
reports.
that's in the middle of March. So I think what I'm saying is I don't think there was that strategic debate in February.
Sorry, my mistake. There was a debate in March. It just wasn't in February.
Yes.
Why, when the virus, it was plain, had already come to these shores at the beginning of March, was time spent on this doctrinal or strategic debate, which of course culminates in a realization on the 13th of March, we're doomed.
I think large parts of the system thought there was no alternative to the current plan in the first week of March.
No alternative to?
The current plan, the plan to mitigate.
Was time spent debating reasonable worst case scenario, mitigation, suppression, herd immunity, behavioural fatigue? Because governments like plans. They want to be able to say, this is our plan, this is our strategy, this is what we're doing.
I think people genuinely thought in the system as a whole, Department of Health and the Cabinet Office, in the first week of March, that the plan as published on the 3rd of March was the correct approach.
Is that the action plan?
Yes.
Contain, delay?
Yes.
Do you accept that, as it happened, control had already been lost by the 3rd of March?
When you look at the facts now, yes.
But that was just an action plan, although described by some of your colleagues as a communication paper, which said, this is what we'll do. We'll control it, and then if we can't control it, we'll delay it, and if we can't delay it, we'll mitigate the consequences. Why was this debate about mitigation or suppression still going on?
Because delay means mitigate. And so the plan as set out on the 3rd is a mitigation plan. And everything in the language is about delaying the peak. Suppression brings forward and curtails the peak. So the approach was very much the delay approach until it was shifted.
Let me put it bluntly to you. A great deal of time and energy appears to have been devoted to drawing up the action plan, talking about delay and mitigation and suppression, and in the event, behavioural fatigue and herd immunity. Whilst all the time it was known that the infection fatality rate was 1%. The hospital